Good evening. My name is Buffy. I'm also the recovering perfectionist mama, and today we're going to talk about the Department of Education and what has been put on the table as far as dismantling it potentially and how that will affect not only the students, so the consequences of that, also talking about the history of the department, how this will also affect vulnerable students, those with disabilities and such, special education plans and things like that. Also, what is needed to get rid of the Department of Education, and what does the Department of Education do if you don't know, and then key programs that could potentially be affected. And also, there has been a recent issue with kind of distrust of the department and what's motivating that with the Department of Education. And then also, can federal programs still exist if the Department of Education is actually dismantled? So first of all, we're going to talk about what are the consequences of dismantling the Department of Education for students with disabilities and other vulnerable populations of students. The White House is expected to issue an executive order. That has been President Trump's main mode of the executive branch that he's been using. He's been using the executive order, and he is expected to issue an order to dismantle the Department of Education. And how will this affect the students? So essentially, by stripping the Department of resources, he could directly impact those students and those communities, especially lower socioeconomic students who are relying on the funding and such for that, and may need extra educational assistance, extra educational help that could come by way of reading assistance, maybe more additional paras. Also, there is the civil rights component to that, civil rights based on race, based on gender, and based on disability. So that could potentially be gutted as well. And also, Trump will urge Congress to vote to dismantle the Department of Education. Now, the history of the Department of Education began in '79 initially as a cabinet position through President Jimmy Carter. In 1980, it became a formal, established organization in the Department of Education. In the recent past, the House has tried to strip schools of critical funding, which, nothing comes free, nothing runs without funds. So by stripping that, that is another way to try to get rid of it. Also launching national school voucher programs, and providing less funding and less oversight for private charter organizations. Also allowing the immigration and customs enforcement raids in schools has also been allowed recently. Some even argue that these cuts are to be used for the tax cuts that are trying to be passed for higher socioeconomic individuals. And so how does cutting the Department of Education affect vulnerable students? 90% of the United States students attend public school. 95% of disabled students, whether that's autism, which is something that I am very well familiar with, given that I do have a child who is on the spectrum. And so I understand that there are special needs that are individual to students who have certain disabilities. And so according to Betty Pringle, who is the National Education Association president, these cuts are essentially giving up our future, because I think to look at certain vulnerable populations, like whether it be low income population or, a minority population or a disabled population, and deciding to cut funds towards them is essentially giving them a disadvantage and less opportunity. And so Pringle also fears that if the Department of Education is gutted, the following could occur. Resources for vulnerable students could be gone. Class sizes could get much, much larger. And that has been a huge issue in recent years, with class sizes, trying to have them small, manageable, so that students can learn more and get more access to teachers. Cut job training programs, get rid of students' civil rights protections, make higher education out of reach for middle class families. And this was also laid out in Project 2025. What is needed to get rid of the Department of Education? It requires an act of Congress, and also an act of essentially the legislators standing up and supporting a strong federal role in education, and sustaining a quality education for all students, which is very important because the students and the children right now are our futures. Last year, the DOE elimination there was actually a bill that they were seeking an amendment to be able to get rid of the Department of Education. And that would have eliminated the DOE, but it failed. There was a new bill introduced in the House recently calling for elimination of the Department of Education by the end of 2026, which seems very, very soon. Dismantling could be difficult, meaning because a lot of the taxpayers and a lot of the voters are against dismantling the DOE, I guess, depending on what political spectrum they fall on. But it would be much easier to get rid of their key functions, and stripping of it of its funds could be a real possibility, according to experts, like killing it without officially killing it. According to the Wall Street Journal, the White House is weighing a series of executive orders that could abolish programs that are not explicitly or laid out explicitly or expressly stated in the department's statute, and transferring other functions to other federal departments, essentially gutting the DOE without actually closing the Department of Education. Lawmakers are promising a back to states approach because it seems that there are a lot of people who've become more distrustful of the federal government and would feel more comfortable if the states did a lot of things. But this kind of belies the truth. Essentially, government is government. And the issue is that promising back to the states sounds like a better idea maybe in theory, but would it actually be in practice? And also this would, again, heavily impact lower income students in rural, suburban, and even urban areas, and students with disabilities, all of which would have a lot to lose in this equation. What does the DOE do, or the Department of Education? They enforce federal statutes that prohibit discrimination. If dismantled, this means defunding programs that feed, educate, and protect the vulnerable and the underserved. They administer Pell Grants. They administer federal student loans, loan repayment forgiveness programs. 30% of college students rely on federal loans to fund their tuition. If lost, there's a possibility of higher dropout rates, fewer choices, lack of opportunities. Education is the way that a lot of students who are unable to afford otherwise are able to go out and serve their communities. That's the big issue behind the loan repayment, for instance. I know some people are against that, but there's a lot of people who've gotten an education and then come back and service a community, especially an underserved community. Recently, Trump signed an executive order that was designed to drain resources from public schools through school vouchers, which are opposed by a majority of voters. According to the Wall Street Journal, 60% of voters oppose elimination of the DOE, and the similar majority support in this scenario also supports prioritizing education over tax cuts. Key programs that could be affected: Title I directs money to schools with high concentrations of students living in poverty. Provider support such as reading specialists, which I mentioned before, smaller class sizes, which are important, especially for students who have disability or have some sort of disability that affects their learning, maybe reading or issues with math or dyslexia, any sort of thing like that. And could end if, as proposed in Project 2025, they turn these funds into block grants that are directed to the states, which would essentially kind of get rid of accountability and oversight. Also, according to the Center for American Progress, 180,000 teaching positions could be lost, affecting 2.8 million students in low income communities. Again, I mean, that's the most vulnerable people that, need the education and need the help and need the teachers. As we know, the teachers aren't getting rich teaching. They're doing it because they have the passion for it and the joy for it and the love for it, and they want to help in their community. Individual with Disabilities Act provides $15 billion to support students with disabilities. If dismantled and transferred to another agency, it's less likely that these students will get the resources that has been allocated to them. It's less likely that they will be protected from discrimination and such. And many actually expect the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights to be transferred to the Department of Justice, which would weaken the ability to protect the students against discrimination based on race, gender, or disability, and making them much more vulnerable. Also, there would be lower levels of moderation, academic achievement, and higher risk of dropping out potentially. On March 11th, nearly 50% of Department of Education workforce was cut from 4,133 to 2,183. So the Department of Education has said that it will deliver on all its statutory payments. That is responsible for including formula funding, student loans, Pell Grants, funding for special education students, and competitive grant making. Some are skeptical that they will be able to carry out all their duties given their 50% reduction in the workforce. Some say it may be a good thing, maybe cut some of the government bureaucracy. Maybe there's some people that aren't holding their own. So I guess time will tell on that. Beth Maglione, who's the interim president and CEO of the National Association of Student Financial Affairs Administration, said that claiming losing half of your workforce and then still saying that it won't affect you, even though that there's no clear plan, is kind of disingenuous. And she went on to state it also raises serious concerns about the billions of dollars in federal student aid and whether it will continue to be dispersed to students without interruption. So, I mean, again, that remains to be seen here. She also indicates that another organization, the NASFAA, has publicly called for a need for reorganization and greater accountability within the department, but any reform should be strategic. And they actually say with a scalpel rather than a chainsaw. So dozens of employees have also been out on leave since about the January 31st, due to the executive order banning federal diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So that's another more employees that are even gone. The Department of Education awarded $120.6 billion in federal loans, grants, and work study funds in the fiscal year 2024 to more than 8.9 million college or career students, according to an unaudited report by the Federal Student Aid. So what is causing the distrust of the Department of Education? There is an idea about historical opposition, which essentially says that the idea that no authority was explicitly or plainly stated to be given to the federal government to regulate education. And so therefore it belongs to the states. Since it is not specifically given to the federal government in the Constitution, it must go to the states. Again, that's kind of a, plain language argument versus, what can be explicitly extrapolated or, gained from reading the particular statute. Again, that's kind of getting into the weeds, but I just thought I would share that. Happen to be a Constitution nerd, so there we go. Also, there have been recent allegations of indoctrination of morals. A lot of people are really concerned about that. I know that there's been some issues with people being concerned about critical race theory and certain things that people are reading in literature and such. And so a lot of people are really kind of concerned about that. Also, many rural conservatives actually support the Department of Education, given that, their community is much smaller. There isn't as much access to certain things that would need to be as larger communities, so they have less access. Also, there's been a shift in the United States. A lot of people feel like there's too much government oversight in education, and they are trying to put everything to the states to make decisions because they feel like the states are much more like small, more concise, maybe easier accessible than federal. Also, COVID-19 essentially brought out the idea that parents should have more control in their child's education. And so the American public's views of the Department of Education have also played a big role. For instance, 45% of people have an unfavorable view of the Department of Education, 44% have a favorable view, and 11% are unsure, which is fair because, I mean, the Department of Education has a lot going on, and, so there's a lot of things that people don't know. Also, politically, 64% of conservatives have an unfavorable view, and 62% of liberal-leaning people have a favorable view. So it tends to go kind of along party lines there. Also, can federal programs survive a dismantling of the DOE? Many believe that the federal grants and the items mentioned above could be seen by another federal agency or dispersed to an individual state, as I think the current president is also believing that as well. Federal loans could be moved to the Department of Treasury or to private for-profit organizations. Experts also believe that the Pell Grant would be unaffected, so that's good news for people that are actually dependent upon the Pell Grant. Aaron Boxer, the founder and CEO of Diversified Education Services, said workforce reduction is likely to lead in delays in processing of FAFSA and the efficiency of dispersing aid. So could also potentially harm historically Black colleges, as they may rely more heavily on federal funds, according to Boxer. So here's your call to action. First of all, I would say if you are very affected by this video and very upset by some of the things that you've learned today, definitely call your legislature, definitely call your lawmakers. They are the ones who are ultimately in charge and dealing with voting and things like that, because this is going to come up probably very, very soon. Also, if you got value from this video, I would like to ask you to like and subscribe. And if you have any other issues that you're, concerned about or interested in, feel free to leave a comment or whatever. Again, thank you for watching my video, and I hope you have a great night. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.